Welcome everyone to a truly exciting event, and thank you so much for your patience and waiting until we get everyone into the room there. We've got 1,000 women people coming on to the launch call tonight, so it took us a wee bit of time to get everyone on. It's going to be such an exciting event, the launch to celebrate the publishing of The Woman Who Wouldn't Wheesht. I'm Julie McGee, I'm the lead for FiLiA Scotland, and FiLiA is so happy to have been able to support this event. FiLiA has been building networks in Scotland ever since the very successful FiLiA Glasgow conference in 2023. All of the tickets there sold out before a single speaker was announced, and at one point there was 760 women on the waiting list alone. FiLiA has continued to promote feminism in Scotland and respond to the needs of Scottish women, recently organising Silencing Scottish Women, an in real life event in response to the enactment of the Hate Crime Act. It was organised within a week and 200 women attended. FiLiA holds the biggest grassroots feminist conferences in Europe, but FiLiA does so much more than that, delivering on a phenomenal number of projects both locally and nationally. We're coming up to the 10th FiLiA conference, which is going to be so special. It's got a huge capacity for 3,000 women, and over 900 tickets for that have been sold already. It takes place in the south of England next year in October. The best place to hear more about the work that FiLiA undertakes and the outcomes that it achieves is through the FiLiA newsletter, and hopefully shortly a link to enable you to sign up to that will appear in the chat shortly. But we've got a really exciting evening ahead of us with some wonderful women who've contributed to this amazing and politically important book waiting to speak. As a charity, I need to highlight that some of our panellists have been or are politicians, but they're here tonight as contributors to this fantastic book and not to represent any political party. The woman who will introduce them, Mandy Rhodes, is a very wonderful woman herself and barely needs an introduction. Mandy is one of Scotland's most senior journalists, and her knowledge and understanding of public life and politics in Scotland is unrivalled. She's a brilliant writer, and she very recently won Columnist of the Year in the Scottish Press Awards just last week. I'll now pass you over to Mandy to introduce the rest of the evening.
Thanks, Julie, and hello, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to be chairing tonight's proceedings of quite naturally an all-women panel of contributors, and particularly pleased to be interviewing, in what I'm told is a world-first exclusive, the two mighty women who thought it was a good idea to chart all that we have gone through over the last 5 or 6 years and bring it together in this fabulous book. My long-standing friend, Susan Dalgety, and my more recent friend, all-round policy advisor, sometimes column confidant, Lucy Hunter Blackburn. Susan and I have known each other for well over 30 years. She's a newspaper columnist, an author, and very importantly, a grandmother. She worked in government for a former Labour First Minister, was a councillor, and does incredibly important work with the McConnell International Foundation, which works with women and girls in Malawi. Basically, she's all about empowerment. Her first book, The Spirit of Malawi, was published in 2021 by Lewis Press. Lucy is a recovering civil servant in the Scottish Government. And believe me, there's no one more rooted in policy and its efficacy than Lucy. She's now a freelance researcher, part of the influential Murray Blackburn Mackenzie Policy Analysis Collective, that's not easy to say, which has done extraordinary work in the context of the proposed legislation around gender recognition reform, indeed anything that impacts on women and girls. She is basically forensically focused on the facts and the unintended consequences of perhaps well-intentioned policy initiatives. That doesn't always make her popular with politicians. And to that end, she completed a doctorate examining the difference between rhetoric and reality in student funding, which makes for interesting reading. So, you two, I think, hello to both of you.
Hello.
I think one of the joys of the pain and frustration that we've all experienced in the last 5 or 6 years, as we've spoken out about this, has actually been women coming together. And we're fighting battles that perhaps we thought we'd won. I just want to get a first impression from both of you of not the negativity that we've all felt, but some of the positivity. Susan.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Only last week when we were having a drink, some of the authors, Joanna Cherry said, that this was one of the greatest things she had done in the last few years, working with women across all parties, none, women from all different backgrounds, women from right across Scotland, the rest of the UK. It's been an absolute liberation and an absolute celebration of women of all ages. And I hope this is just the start of another feminist journey. I hate that word journey, but hey.
I mean, I have now got a much larger circle of women friends.
Yes,
I
yes.
realised that over my 30s and my 40s, you get buried in your professional life, you have friends, but you don't. My ability to meet women and make friends with women of all ages has just it's unrecognizable from 10 years ago. And I did a Twitter thread just the other day saying it's a bittersweet feeling doing this, because in many ways many of us would rather have not gone through everything here, but it's impossible not to notice that there has been this incredible positive side, which is I have this really rich and very varied collection of women friends, and they don't all agree with each other, and it's wonderful, and they disagree on lots of important things, but on this one thing we can come together, and that has been amazing.
I mean, I think that's the other thing. Susan mentioned inspiration, and there are lots of other descriptors around that, but also there's a revelation in this that not everyone does agree. And with some of that actually quite hard, Lucy, because for those of us, I guess, and I don't particularly like this phrase, this side of the argument, it's quite hard to argue with anybody else because they don't engage.
It's disappointing, isn't it? Because you think there's a wonderful quote early in the book from, I think it's Susan Sinclair who did the Scottish Women website, and she said she looked at, I think it was anti-bullying policies in schools, and she thought, well, something's not right here, that they've just missed out the girls and women, but they can't have meant to. And her quote is heartbreaking. It's something like, but if someone just points it out to them, it'll be fine. And I think this whole book is full of women saying that. I noticed this, but I thought, if I pointed it out, people go, oh yeah, I see that, that's fine, that's a very fair point. And it's the constant heartbreak of women feeling that they've got this really not very difficult idea, and hitting brick walls and not being listened to, and being then put in this extraordinary box of what a terrible person they are. And I think that's a recurring theme in the book, is that women just walk into this not expecting it to be what it is, and then they find once they're in the argument they have to keep going, but they're not being heard. I mean, this is a book about women who wouldn't wheesht, but it's also women who they went on not wheeshting but not being heard.
And also being told that our views were not valid. That was the one thing that I still can't get my head round, because no matter...
From the First Minister of Scotland, Susan.
Former First Minister of Scotland, and from a woman who had succeeded tremendously in her career, helped by other women. And for her to say that the views of a lot of women, I won't say it's all the women in Scotland, but views of now, I think, the majority of women in Scotland on this particular issue, but it was about women's rights and our rights to speak out and our right to be heard and our views to be considered. We were just told your views are not valid.
I thought it was interesting because for both of you, for different reasons and in different roles, have been at the heart of government and politics and policy. How disappointing is it for you both to have found suddenly politicians weren't listening to you?
I'm heartbreaking, actually. I think I wouldn't say disappointing. Now, it's not politicians, but also the civil service machine. I would say it's broken my heart. I was a very committed civil servant. I thought it mattered. I do still think public service matters, and I do know there are plenty of civil servants who feel that way. So I'm not suggesting that has gone, but there was something. It was a dystopian feeling to contact government and make points and put in papers and listen to other people's experience of that. Again, what we've done in the book, which no one's done before, is actually talk to the women who were in sooner than either of us were in this fight, and we're trying very hard from late 2017 to talk to government. And I had long conversations with 2 or 3 of them, which the book can't begin to do justice, to be honest, to the richness of those conversations. And what heartbreak is the word I will keep coming back to. They came away shell-shocked that what felt like such ordinary arguments, and I need to come back to these are not wild arguments people are making, were hitting this absolute brick wall, and it is totally disappointing.
But, and I am an eternal optimist, what it did give us all, I think, was I, who have been tribal in my politics for much of my life, I suddenly realised that there were things that I had in common with Pam Gosal, Rachel Hamilton, with Caroline McAllister, with people whose core political beliefs, say nationalism or, conservatism, I disagreed with. But on the fundamental thing about me and my granddaughters and, my mothers and sisters as women, we stood shoulder to shoulder. And that has been an absolute revelation.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. The bonds that and the connections. And that was actually, I think I'll go after the referendum. I think that there were different political trenches, and they just melted away. And we now talk across these boundaries, and it doesn't matter. And we know these disagreements exist. We know people have different views on this, and that's fine. And in fact, as a sort of it's been reinvigorating in a way to find that you can do that. You can still work across these quite important boundaries, and it's not because any of us have stopped believing these other things, but we can put them to one side for this other thing, and that has been an amazing experience. I agree absolutely.
What stopped you not stopping?
For me, it was absolute rationality, because I could not get my head round, let's look at self-ID, I could not get my head round the core of that piece of legislation, that you could change your legal sex simply by self-declaration. It did not make any rational sense to me. And then the following on from that, the impact that would have on women and girls. So I never once thought of giving up, because it was illogical not to.
I think I'm the same, really. I was pulled into a corner. I'm going to name Lisa McKenzie here. I was pulled into a corner by Lisa McKenzie sometime in about late 2017, saying, was I aware of what was going on? At this point, obviously, there was a consultation out in Scotland, and what was, but it was stories like Girl Guiding. And that in Girl Guiding, suddenly you would ignore people's sex if they not because of GRA reform, but because already if they told you that their sex didn't matter anymore and you shouldn't care about it, then that's what you should think. And I was thinking Girl Guiding of all things, and you started the youth hostel dormitories, and it was actually those kind of very on the ground situations. Yep. So it wasn't actually so much the legal stuff, or the legal stuff comes in behind to cement that in. It was the actual discovery that out there in the world, we were already, these things were happening. And I thought, I'm old enough and been around enough to know that there are times that sex matters. And once you've got that and the no debate, and it just felt like something, once you'd seen it, you couldn't unsee it. And once you got to that point, you had to carry on. And I was very lucky because I had Lisa, as a friend involved right through to talk to, and then Kath as well. So it never felt isolating. So one thing I would say was very important for me, that I was never in an isolated position doing this. I was always doing it with 2 people who I deeply trust and respect, and that's made it easy to keep going.
Talking about things that you can't unsee, I think the Isla Bryson case perhaps opened the doors for a lot of people to actually speak a lot more openly.
Yes.
Was that a bit of I don't know if I'm allowed to swear, but I will, because I do. Was that a bit of a kind of fuck me moment?
Yes. Oh, yeah, for the whole country.
Yeah.
Well, to see on the front page of a well-read tabloids a photograph of a man with his penis poking through his burgundy leggings. Every picture tells a story. He was a double rapist. He was not a woman. End of.
And I think what then happens is the political people, people have very busy lives. Most people don't do a lot of politics. They dip in and out, and they do still. I think despite the cynicism about politics, people at a deep level, I think I have it still, kind of think the system will sort of self-correct. It means, well, the grown-ups will be in the room. And I think what we saw with Bryson suddenly was the most senior politicians, people like Nicola Sturgeon, who was so in control of her messaging, just like a goldfish. And thinking, coming up with rapist as a gender, and you're going, this is, and you can see, or sex, in fact, and you can see the political class melting in front of your eyes. And so people who hadn't been paying this much attention and weren't tuning in, even at that point, weren't necessarily tuning into the detail of the argument, that what they were picking up was politicians who looked absolutely lost, and they looked lost after years and years to think about this. I think that's the point.
And in terms of the way that perhaps we've had a few watershed moments, including the cast review as well, has anybody ever apologised to you for the way that they perhaps may have framed you?
No, I don't.
Do you wait on that?
I
I
think
don't think so.
the apology should be given to the parents of the children who in the last, say, 10 years in Scotland, children, sometimes vulnerable children, impressionable adolescents, who have been convinced that they are living in the wrong body, when in fact they're adolescents coming to terms with their physical changes, coming to terms with their sexuality. I think they are the young people, and their parents, they're the people who deserve an apology from everybody who is responsible for this.
But also,
Sorry, Lucy.
I was going to say, and there are women who put themselves forward to speak at great personal cost and were rejected. They deserve an apology too.
We're about to go into, well, we are going into a general election campaign. Have you got faith in any of the politicians to take this forward? And has it made you have to rethink your own politics?
I think what the book is about a failure of Scottish politics. If I look across the last week or two of campaigning, the first couple of weeks of general election campaigning, I don't see as much evidence that failure couldn't happen again. That seems to me the risk of that failure of Scottish politics playing out again at UK level is quite high at the moment, because I still don't think the politicians across the political spectrum really get it. Not enough of them really get what this is about, why things happened the way they did in Scotland, and what the risks are, and how all the different elements of this agenda connect up to, and they don't get it. So my politics, certainly my faith in politicians to stop and think has been quite daunting, because I worked a lot with politicians in the civil service. I used to spend a lot of time in taxis defending politicians from taxi drivers, saying, these people work. They did. My ministers, I would say, they work really hard. You have no idea. Some of them are better than others to deal with, but on the whole, here I am. But I have looked across, and this obtuseness, I'm going to have to say, which spans the parties, and you get individuals who stick out, like beacons, who are not like that. It has actually made me generally, I think, more, I don't want to say cynical, but less optimistic. I have to work harder for the optimism that we do need to have in politics, because we can't afford not to have it.
But the women aren't going away, so.
Yeah. And on that note, I'm afraid I'm the one that says, hold your Wheesht, you two, because there's never enough time for us to talk about everything we want to talk about. And I will come back to you at the end with questions that have been submitted by people that are attending tonight. So don't go away and don't go on the gin.
Not yet.
We're going to hear shortly from 4 women that have contributed to the Women Who Wouldn't Wheesht book, and they will read various passages from it. But first, the poet Magi Gibson, who I'll properly introduce later when she reads for us, has a very important message from the woman who actually did step forward a number of years ago on behalf of us all to use her power and her stature on the world stage to try and bring some sense to what was already becoming a very febrile and toxic environment for many of us. Maggie has a message from JK Rowling, who has also written a chapter in the book, chapter 13, Wheesht for the Witch Burners. Maggie.
Thank you very much, Mandy. And I was delighted to be asked to read this for Jo Rowling tonight. Jo's statement. I'm so sorry I can't be with you tonight, but I'm very definitely there in spirit. As I've already said publicly, I'm immensely proud to be counted among the women in this book. Many of my fellow contributors had already risked their livelihoods and reputations before I spoke out, and their courage remains my inspiration. Our opponents in the battle to protect women's rights tend to operate on the divide and conquer principle. Every woman speaking out in the current climate will be familiar with the attempts to cast her as a lone outcast voice, or at best, part of an eccentric fringe of society. But we know differently. And speaking personally, I have the letters and emails to prove it. This book is the best evidence so far of the breadth of women's solidarity and the effectiveness of grassroots action. No matter the threats and abuse, I've never regretted outing myself as gender critical. My fellow contributors and I have all been through trial by fire and emerged stronger and more united. Truly, we are the witches they can't burn. The campaign for women's sex-based rights has always been and always will be one of the causes of my life. May the women who wouldn't Wheesht continue to stand as an example to our daughters and a warning to misogynists everywhere of what happens when you piss off Scottish women. May we never hod. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maggie. And I'd now like to introduce Jenny Lindsay. Jenny is a poet, performer, essayist and events programmer who was the winner of the inaugural John Byrne Award for Critical Thinking in 2020. Her debut non-fiction book, Hounded, Women, Harms and the Gender Wars, is forthcoming from Polity Books. So that's another one to get on your reading list. And none of that short biog quite touches the pain that Jenny has experienced by being frozen out by peers, colleagues and friends for having the temerity to express an opinion. Jenny is going to read an extract from chapter 21 in the book, The Women the Committee Wouldn't See. Jenny.
Oh, okay, thanks very much, Mandy. Yes, before I start, I'd just like to thank Anonymous One and Ms. M for trusting me to deliver their words. I'm going to share the final paragraph of Anonymous One, and then I'm going to share the full account from Ms. M, and then I'll return to Anonymous One at the end. Anonymous One finishes her excerpt by saying, "Many things have to align for survivors to speak. We have to be healed enough, find the confidence and drive and the platforms to speak, become knowledgeable, use the right language and tone, be ready to tell our stories and be confident we will be heard. I was prepared to share my story, yet my government refused to hear my evidence, and my First Minister called me and women like me transphobic, bigoted and right-wing. It was shameful. Women and girls deserved better." And now for the words of Ms. M, who on Tuesday, the 20th of December 2022, was one of the women that the committee refused to see and who attended the Scottish Parliament. Well, I am just one of many Scottish women who has experienced male violence, and specifically one of the 5 women the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee examining the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill refused to meet. In June 2022, I volunteered my time to speak to the committee about how self-ID has and will continue to negatively impact upon me as a survivor. It was not an easy offer to make, not least because in June 2022, I was also due in the Sheriff Court to face my rapist, already a convicted sex offender. I knew it'd be difficult, and add an extra layer of stress at an already stressful time, but I wanted to share my experiences with the committee to help ensure MSPs had considered female survivors of male violence. I spent June waiting on a date to appear before both the court and the committee. My court case came and went, but the invitation to attend the committee never arrived. Instead, I was invited to submit a written piece. Incidentally, my perpetrator didn't show up to court either. In that respect, he and the Equalities Committee have a lot in common, both confident they're the good guys, yet neither can bear to look me in the eye. When I obtained tickets to attend the Scottish Parliament's final debate on the GRR bill in December 2022, I recognised that as a survivor of rape, sexual assault and domestic abuse, it was likely I would hear things that I would find upsetting, distressing and frustrating. I had to think about how to keep myself psychologically safe. Aside from a few women I'd met a couple of times at events, I'd be alone. I decided if it got too much for my grounding exercises to cope, then I would leave. Part of my safety plan involved staying at accommodation within walking distance of the Parliament. 5 hours into stage 3 proceedings at around 7 p.m. on Tuesday, 20th December, the majority of our MSPs voted to allow registered sex offenders and those awaiting trial to change their identification by self-ID. A woman stood to leave, shouting, "Shame on you," in protest. The presiding officer's knee-jerk response was to clear everyone from the public gallery. I began to dutifully shuffle along the road towards the exit, but it was blocked by a group of women and Scottish Parliament officials having a discussion about whether we should leave. I could feel and I could hear my heartbeat ringing in my ears. I felt completely overwhelmed by the vote I'd just witnessed, by the Scottish Parliament's heavy-handed response to women's outrage at that vote, by the contempt shown to survivors. All MSP's eyes appeared to be looking up at us. As the group began to swell, so did my feelings of panic. Slipping into autopilot, I sat down, looked straight ahead and took some deep breaths. I was looking out over the chamber. It didn't seem real. I felt as if I was looking into the scene through a window. I don't know what was being said because it all sounded as if I was underwater. I felt tiny as I tried to breathe. I'd taken a few deep breaths and focused on the feeling of my feet touching the floor, wiggling my toes, when I heard a woman behind me who I assume worked there speak. She said, "Can I ask you to leave?" And I replied, "Yes, you can." She asked, "Will you leave?" And I replied, "No." She told me that the police might arrest me. Despite my best efforts, my window of tolerance was pretty non-existent by this point. I jumped to my feet and I shouted at my Parliament that I had come to listen quietly, that I was being put out due to the actions of another woman, and now I was being threatened with arrest. Police Scotland wouldn't arrest my rapist, I told them, but they will threaten to arrest me, a woman like me, for sitting quietly. I think I also pointed out what should be obvious to anyone, that sex offenders lie, manipulate, and can't be relied upon to do the right thing. At some point, a bottle of Coke fell from my pocket and I picked it up as I continued talking. The female security officer was now to my right and telling me that waving the bottle made me look aggressive. At some point, she grasped my forearm, presumably to lead me out. I pulled away and reminded her she had no right to touch me, and I left of my own volition. Sat in the foyer and cried into my cup of tea at the frustration and injustice of it all. I felt ashamed for my outburst. I had not intended to disclose my rape, and I worried who within the chamber had heard me speak of my rape and if they would use it against me. Riddle Wadwa, the male CEO of Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre, walked past, looking directly at me. It occurred to me, not for the first time, that perhaps I'd have more robust coping mechanisms around my trauma if I had had the option to access single-sex women's services. While gathering myself, several women approached me to provide comfort and some well-received hugs. They reassured me I'd not spoken out of turn and I had articulated some of their own thoughts and concerns. To be surrounded by women was exactly what I needed, and we sat in disbelief before the Parliament announced they were allowing all visitors to re-enter the viewing gallery. We filed back in, and I left around 30 minutes later, exhausted by the day's events. And a reminder of what Anonymous One said. Many things have to align for survivors to speak. We have to be healed enough, find the confidence and drive and the platforms to speak, become knowledgeable, use the right language and tone, be ready to tell our stories, and be confident we will be heard. I was prepared to share my story, yet my government refused to hear my evidence, and my First Minister called me, a woman like me, transphobic, bigoted, and right-wing. It was shameful. Women and girls deserved better.
Oh, thank you, Jenny. That's a very, very hard read and makes a bit of a mockery of the so-called People's Parliament. However, it's now my great pleasure to introduce a politician who I'm sure was sitting shaking her head throughout that. A politician I've got to know well through all of this, Pam Gosal, MBE. Pam is a Scottish Conservative MSP for the West Scotland region. She previously sat on the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee, the one that was responsible for scrutinising the Gender Recognition Reform (brackets Scotland close brackets) bill. And it's fair to say she has faced a lot of hostility among her political colleagues, simply for standing up for the rights of women and girls, and particularly for raising the issues that might be faced by women of faith when it comes to the preservation of single-sex services. Pam will read an extract from chapter 20. Pam.
Thank you, Mandy. I'm proud to have contributed to this collection of essays documenting an important moment in contemporary history about how a grassroots women's movement took on the political establishment and changed the course of history. I'm so proud to be considered as one of the women who wouldn't Wheesht. It was important for me not only to give a voice to women and girls and to protect single-sex spaces and services, but also to stand up and be that voice for women and girls from different faiths. You always have that one memory that stands out from a significant moment in your life. And for me, the fear felt throughout the whole process is etched in my mind. But you had my back, week in, week out. We're showing up in the committee, in the chamber, outside, in perhaps one of the largest protests outside the Scottish Parliament. Instead of being scared, I felt brave, and I questioned what needed to be questioned. And I stood up when it mattered. And none of this would have been possible if it wasn't for the women that are on this call today. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for being there for us. In May 2021, I made history and shattered the glass ceiling when I was elected to the Scottish Parliament as the first Indian female, the first Sikh member of the Scottish Parliament, and one of the first 2 women of colour elected both in 2021. So from the outset, I've been aware that Holyrood is not as diverse as some parties like to pretend. As a member of the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee, which scrutinised the bill, I had the front row seat to how insular, narrow-minded and browbeating the Scottish Parliament can be at its worst. And make no mistake, this bill was our Parliament at its worst. The committee stacked up evidence it wanted to include, and almost everything and everyone who didn't fit with the government's view was limited using any means possible. In many cases, conclusions were reached before evidence had been heard. As a member of the committee, I came to my judgment cautiously. Even when I instinctively disagreed, I listened carefully. I wish everyone had done the same. But the process seemed to be an exercise in rubber stamping the flawed bill before us. No matter the practical flaws it contained or the destructive way that it would strike at the heart of fundamental issues of faith and conscience, evidence was taken from a selective hand-picked group of organisations. The whole parliamentary process was rushed through without fully considering viewpoints. In May 2022, I wrote a letter to the committee noting how the witness list is overwhelmingly skewed towards those in support of the general principles of the bill. The committee itself had an unfriendly atmosphere away from the public eye. My colleague, Rachel Hamilton, and I were repeatedly shut down when we raised concerns about the scrutiny of this legislation. I began to grow extremely concerned when women's groups, particularly those representing women of faith, were too frightened to speak out due to the fear for their safety or credibility. The case of United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls, Dr. Reem Asalem, was the worst and clearest example of the way that any dissenting view was sidelined. Despite her obvious expertise, it took my colleague Rachel Hamilton MSP writing to the committee, followed by a further pressure from myself for this meeting to even be set up. They refused at first, even though they had readily heard from another United Nations expert. Eventually, they relented for an online meeting, but only on the day before the final stage of the bill began, and at the last possible moment, so her views could not possibly be fully considered by the committee. When we objected to the committee's approach, we were shouted down. We were outvoted without any meaningful debate. Rachel Hamilton and I, the two Scottish Conservative MSPs on the committee, had no choice but to submit a minority opinion report so we could at least have it on record that not everybody agreed. This is not a typical practice in the Parliament. At times, it was lonely and depressing experience. I was often left searching for answers, asking, why? Why is our Parliament so afraid of debate? Why can't it cope with opposing views? Why is the bill being pushed through in the flawed form? This went beyond politics for me. As a woman and as a minority ethnic woman, I felt unheard. Throughout the process, I was heartened by the cross-party support from outside the chamber. The only positive to come from this bill was the political awakening of thousands of women across Scotland who came together during this process to stand up for their beliefs, their safety, and their rights. That kept me going when it got really difficult. They made me feel part of a movement. I knew the cause we were fighting for was worth it. Their strength of feeling gave me the strength to keep speaking up. Their passion was a daily inspiration. I will do my utmost to ensure the voice of women and girls are not ignored by the Scottish Government again.
Thank you, Pam, and for all that you do and not for being one of the herd. We're now going to hear from Nicole Jones. Nicole is an artist based in Edinburgh. Her work, primarily in portraiture, focuses on documenting the contemporary women's movement. Nicole is reading from chapter 34, called Looking to the Future. And it's worth noting that the final 2 chapters of the book are by young feminists, Nina Welsh and Nicole, because, to paraphrase Whitney Houston, they are the future. Nicole.
Hey there. I was graduating at the time I wrote this, so this was kind of me reflecting on my university experience. I have attended most of the events promoting gender identity theory on campus, in which I took notes, asked questions, and engaged respectfully. I wish the groups opposing our views would extend the same courtesy. My academic performance soon began to suffer as a result of my political engagement. I struggled to attend classes and interact with peers in the aftermath of violent protests. My trust in the integrity of my higher education institution was further eroded with each cancelled academic event. When I wrote to the principal about my experience as a student witnessing these events, including an incident which led to an elected representative of the student union being charged with an assault against an event attendee, I received the same brief copy-paste reply that was sent to others outside of the university. It included the following: I am very sorry to hear that you have been suffering with anxiety. We are here to help you, and our counselling services can support you with your well-being. It felt as though, rather than addressing the hostile environment, I was expected instead to privately manage my response to the intimidation. The personal and the political had become hopelessly tangled up. I became withdrawn and guarded as a matter of self-preservation. I felt unable to fully explain to my tutors why I experienced such localized anxiety in academic settings. My art practice consists largely of portraiture, including portraits of women involved in the contemporary women's movement, some of whom feature in the documentary Adult Human Female. A sympathetic tutor reassured me, when I alluded to the context surrounding my work, that they were there to support my freedom of expression. But these had been the same words used in the press statements issued by the university after every failed attempt of the Adult Human Female screening, and so they felt empty. While I trusted this particular individual, I didn't trust that I had the support of the institution, or that they had the support of their fellow academics, which was what would matter if push came to shove. Women who are discriminated against on the basis of their gender-critical beliefs face an impossible dilemma in which seeking support poses the risk of exposing them to further abuse. It can be easier, for your own sake and for the sake of everyone around you, to disappear quietly. But as Jenny Lindsay, who's here, wrote in her essay for The Dark Horse, the lesson is not to avoid what happened to me by compromising your writing, second-guessing a hounding, nor to avoid writing about sex, gender, and feminism in whatever way you want to. It is to write with integrity, to stand your ground, to hold your own, and to leave any clique or small forum which makes you feel like you are being compromised. My advice to young women is the same as Jenny's. The war on women is a war on competency. Academics, artists, writers, politicians who are doing their jobs by exploring ideas are being pushed out of their professions and replaced by those who hold its values in contempt. As difficult as it may be in the circumstances, women need to continue to act according to our rights and not as though those rights have already been lost. What we're saying isn't unlawful. It's not even unreasonable. Do not internalize the idea of yourself as being toxic. If you feel you are being compromised, trust that your creative and intellectual freedom will be nurtured elsewhere, and seek to either find or build that space. I feel proud to have worked alongside many competent women to build those spaces. They have given me friendship and mentorship, something I hope to pass on to the next generation. In 2020, I formed XX, a network to support young women experiencing hostility for their feminist views. The false narrative of a generational divide is partly the product of a censorious climate on campus that denies women the freedom of inquiry, association, and expression needed for them to reach or voice their own conclusions. Despite escalating protests, however, growing numbers of young women are now engaging with feminist politics. I've met countless young women who possess a strength of courage and curiosity that makes me hopeful for the future of feminism. I will graduate knowing that I have taken the portraits of groups and individuals I believe make up an important part of women's history. Magdalene Burns features among them. The camaraderie I found in the company of women over half a decade ago has only grown in the years following, with all the women I have met since, the women who wouldn't Wheesht.
Thank you, Nicole. Now I'm delighted to welcome back the poet Magi Gibson. Maggie is a poet and writer, has held 3 Scottish Arts Council fellowships, 1 Royal Literary Fund fellowship, been writer in residence with the Gallery of Modern Art in Glasgow and the Glasgow Women's Library, and was the first Maca of Stirling in 500 years. She's had 6 poetry collections published, and in 2023 edited and published Unbridled, a landmark poetry anthology featuring women who will not be silenced. And yet, Maggie has found herself shunned by the literary world she held so dear. Maggie's going to read a new poem, but first she would like to describe something to you that should shock if we were still capable of being shocked. Maggie.
Thanks very much, Mandy. Yeah, the strange case of TERFs, fascists, author cancellations, book blacklisting, and Literature Alliance Scotland. No, it's not the title of the poem I'm going to read, but of a Substack I wrote very recently. For years now, the arts and cultural sectors in Scotland, as Nicole has just been explaining, the same as in academia, have made life for gender critical feminists very difficult. Much of our exclusion has been by stealth. We could feel the effects, so we knew it was happening, but it was difficult to evidence that the literature sector in Scotland as a whole was not only complicit, but actively enabling discriminatory and vindictive behaviour towards us. The pretense that there is true inclusivity in Scottish literary life collapsed dramatically when Literature Alliance Scotland, who call themselves the collective voice of Scotland's largest literary network, published guidance for the publishing industry, that's bookshops, festivals, events organisers, directly stating, don't sell TERF books or platform TERF authors. In the Substack I wrote in response to that, which went viral, I explained how insulting and discriminatory this advice was, especially coming from a publicly funded body. Literature Alliance Scotland quickly issued an apology, though not a credible explanation for the appearance of this guidance on their website. And now here we are tonight, celebrating this book, The Women Who Wouldn't Wheesht, a book that Literature Alliance Scotland guidance would have advised should not be stocked, sold or promoted. A book that is now a bestseller. I would like to call on Literary Alliance Scotland and associated bodies, including the hugely influential Scottish Book Trust, to go one step further than simply issuing an apology. There is a very real climate of fear amongst many Scottish writers. That's an intolerable situation in the country of the Enlightenment, the country which used to champion free speech. I'd like them to now invite myself and Jenny Lindsay, whom you heard earlier, who've both been so badly affected by stealth policies and attitudes in the book world, to a meeting where they not only listen to our experiences, but make an active commitment to take meaningful steps to end this toxic culture of censure. And now the poem, which I dedicate to all those fighting for women's rights. The poem's called Even in the Darkness and the Depths We Sang. We were the songbirds, so bright, so full of life. We learned our tunes from our mothers' mothers, our voices clear, carrying on swiftly shifting winds. We were the sensitive sixth sense ones, the seventh daughters of seventh daughters, in harmony with the rhythms of the heartbeat of the earth, darting about our small towns, our teeming cities, our far-flung villages. We were the ones who shivered at tiny changes in the atmosphere, who quivered when storm clouds darkened the horizon, while others laughed and played. We were the ones who sang out early warnings when discord roiled the air, who sang of hidden dangers, coming threats, the need to be alert, to be prepared. Some labelled us hysterics, hate-filled harridans. Some tried to drown our voices with their noise, and though we feared their power, even as they claimed they were the powerless ones, we sang our woman truth. On high cliff edges we sang, in thickening mists of confusion, we sang of unintended consequences, of risks of harm. We refused commands for silence, their furious demands for acquiescence, their threats of punishment and violence. We patiently unpicked the tangled wires of their distortions. We deftly snipped through nets of lies they tried to trap us with, endured their stinging pellets of denial and derision. We sang our song of womanhood. We sang golden-voiced canaries deep in the hearts of our communities. We sang at the gates of power. We took our song to Holyrood. We rejected their insults of cow and bitch, embraced it when they called us turf and witch, for like Cassandra, millennia before, we knew it was our fate, even in the face of ridicule and hate, to warn of dangers others had unleashed, to tell our truths, to never hod our wheesht. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maggie. Gosh, so much pain, but so much strength, and that's what we all must take succour from. I'm now going to welcome back Susan and Lucy to put to them some of the questions you've already sent in. I'm very conscious that we're running over time, but hopefully you'll bear with us and stick with us, and we'll hopefully finish by about 7:30. Thank you very much.
Hi,
Susan, hi, you're back. We've got a lot of questions, but we'll see how the time goes and see what we can get through. Oh, sorry, I'm still processing a lot of what people were saying. It's right. First question: how did the women in question deal with the abuse they received, and and do the moderators have any insights on this or experience of their own they could share? Well, I think you both felt the abuse, haven't you?
Yeah.
How did people talk to you about how they coped, really?
I think I'm still processing what I just heard, because because when women actually speak their experience, right, it is even more powerful than it is on the written page, and I'm going to start crying probably in a minute. How women coped is because we held each other. That's how we coped. It's how women. I spend a lot of time in sub-Saharan Africa and Malawi. It's how women in Malawi cope. It's how women in Afghanistan cope. It's how women across the world and across millennia have coped. We hold each other up.
And people are very rude about Twitter, but one of the things that's happened, I remember that one of the women in the book, when her story broke, I didn't know her at all, and it sort of broke over Twitter, and I sent her a DM. We followed each other, and I've had those, and there's the sort of people but there's been a lot of people who just come sideways who you've never met, or I felt very free when I've seen stuff to go and say you're not on your own.
Yes.
You're really not, especially when someone first sort of breaks cover and you see them. And there's been a huge amount more of that than will ever be remembered or charted, and that we've all forgotten probably. But there's been so much of that, and yeah, it's to echo Susan, really.
Yeah, and social media, I mean, Elon Musk, X, Twitter, we won't get into that debate, but Sarah Pedersen in her chapter writes about how we used social media to bring us together. It's been a very powerful tool. So
I can remember sitting in the hairdressers one day in Edinburgh reading Kathleen Stock's book, and a woman came up to me and said, "Oh, you're one of us," which I quite like. Clearly, middle-aged women are not past it. No. Do you think this has helped create a movement of women, or brought us back together, that will mean we are a force to be reckoned with?
You do that.
You do that one.
I absolutely think that. I mean, I'm actually post middle age, I suppose, in my 60s, and I think what's happened over the last few years is that women of a certain age have found their voice. I mean, there's a lot of blokes, and I use the word bloke deliberately, who still do not want to listen to us. Sadly, there's a lot of young women. I was struck by what Lucy said earlier, in her 30s and 40s, and I was the same in my 30s and 40s. You're focused on building your own career, your own, whatever. But now, I think that, and unfortunately, I think there are still too many young women in Scotland, and probably across the rest of the UK, who think we don't need feminism anymore, or liberal feminism is what we need. We're all intersectionalists, blah. The bottom line is that women are still not in our society regarded as equal. That's just a fact. I mean, we can't get away from that. And older women, there's some parts of society who would like us to be invisible. Well, we're not invisible, and the last few years have shown we have found our voice again. But it's wonderful to work and to learn from young women like Nina and like Nicole and the other young women that I have met over the last few years.
I'm going to add one thing to that. One of the bits of the book that I enjoyed writing the most was a very short 2 pages called Funding the Resistance. Because we spent the last 5 years being told we're funded by, the check that never comes, the ruble never arrive, wherever they are. Often, most obviously and most annoyingly, in one case by an organisation that gets a shed load of dollars. And actually, I ended that when writing it with this, saying that there was an underestimation of what women could do. It's as though people looked at lots of women and didn't think you had women with masses of life experience, professional experience, voluntary experience, that they couldn't pull together to do this. It was as though there was this complete incomprehension. We couldn't possibly be doing this. And that's the sexism in there, but there was also a lot of ageism. Who would look at a group of men in their 50s and 60s and go, well, how do they know to do anything? And yet the assumption was that women with decades of working life in all sorts of ways and home lives couldn't do stuff. And I think one of the single most sexist things in this whole thing has been the assumption that we must be guided and funded by shadowy external resources. And I was very satisfied to be able to write down from my own very, I know this I really know how this has actually happened.
Can I just do a follow on from that, Lucy, which is, how disappointing has it been that, if you like, the so-called feminist organisations in Scotland that are mainly centrally funded by government have actually been on the different side of all of this, have not been supportive, are not tweeting about a book that should be a chronicle of feminist fight? I mean,
you think about the kind of organisation that might have a reading week every so often. That kind of organisation.
Why has that happened?
Well, there's a running theme through a book, and there isn't a chapter about the women's organisations. And before we came on, one of the things that we were thinking was, an area, it runs right through a lot of chapters, the sense of being let down really badly. How it's happened. There's a really interesting book written, it's called Grit and Diamonds. I think it's about which had been lectured by a woman, obviously, about the sort of early parts. There's also a very interesting work that's been done in an earlier phase of Rape Crisis Scotland, trying to do an oral history project, what happened was you took movements that were very volunteer-led and very grassroots, and they grew. And they became big multi-million, well, not million, multi-hundred-thousand businesses, and they changed. And they don't need a grassroots because they've got a government funder. They can ignore all of us because it makes no difference. They don't get their income from subscriptions. And it just changes the dynamics. And what I did, to be honest, when I first came into this, I found, I mean, agenda were barely on my radar, but I discovered they existed. They were going to have a meeting. They cancelled the meeting. And there is a disappointment, and I think betrayal isn't too strong a word, and a sense that these organisations are running away from this, and I think that you know what, I think the disappointment is not just they disagree, but they're not as brave as we are. We were all brave and went out there, but they run away. They won't come, you know, they go into hiding. And yeah, it's disappointing. Susan, do you want to?
Yeah. Just what Maggie said about the arts and literary establishment in Scotland, and an open invitation for them to come and speak to the women, then we would love to do a podcast with Engender, for example, to talk about the book, to talk about women's rights. What does it mean? We'd be absolutely, so we open, you know, an open invitation to Engender. Let's sit down as sisters, as women together, and talk about the future.
Yeah. Similarly, I have had those kind of invitations put out to various organisations, and I'm told my values don't align with theirs. But anyway, is it hard to be told you're the wrong kind of feminist?
No, it's quite funny. Actually.
No, it's funny. I mean, I say in the back, one of the things I'd love to say is my mum. So my mum is in her mid-90s, and she started taking spare rib. She was a very cross woman in her late 40s when I first remember noticing all this. So a very cross lady in her late 40s and the 70s, and she started taking spare rib. So I grew up all through my teens with copies of spare rib. I had a copy of spare rib in one hand and a copy of Jackie in the other, and makes me the rounded and balanced person I am. But it was really important. So I've never had the big feminist awakening. It's always been there. I've always had this kind of scaffolding in my head. And so being told often by men that I'm not a good feminist is mainly hilarious.
Yeah. And my mother didn't subscribe to spare rib, but I grew up as a young girl, some struggles, but also believing that I was as good as I was as good as any boy, if not probably better, actually, definitely cleverer. Being told that we were the wrong kind of feminists, or that some people are real feminists and the rest of us aren't, you just laugh at nonsense like that. Mad. Silly, stupid.
Apparently, I'm an old-fashioned feminist. I was told that by a young drag queen. In terms of just an illustration of the reach that you're getting, I've got two questions, one from Australia and one from Canada. No problem. Anyway, Australia's asking, have any of you got any advice for women in Australia where the trans activist agenda is still very dominant in the mainstream press, sports bodies and councils? I mean, I think we've been in the eye of the storm in a way, so it's about what lessons have we learned?
I think, well, this is going to sound a bit left field. I think we were quite lucky in Scotland that we had the Gender Recognition Reform Bill to coalesce round. So that was a single campaigning point. So I'm not sure that that's the same in Australia, but my advice would be just keep going. Speak to as many people as possible. Know that there are far more people out there that agree with you than disagree with you. Use social media, public meetings, good old-fashioned campaigning, and just, when courage calls, just
read the two chapters. Read the chapter written by Susan Smith, the first of her chapters about the early years of FWF form in Scotland. Bear in mind that when people, I first broke cover on this in late 2018, but there are people out there who've been in this. I mean, it's not like Julie Bindle,
Yeah, absolutely.
many women, and there are women whose names are going to, one of the things that worries me is there's a whole host of women who are active in the sort of 15 years or so as they were getting wind of what was going on around this, long before GRA reform became the focus, who have been lost. Women, anonymous accounts on Twitter, for example, who I remember reading when I first started.
Yes.
Were really useful, thoughtful people, and more names like, but Rebecca Riley Cooper, who's a brilliant piece to read when you're coming at this to try and get your head around it. So there's resources out there, but it's going to be a long game. Don't give up, because
Don't give up.
Yeah, don't give up. That's my advice.
Well, question from Canada, and actually I remember the case in Canada, the Wax My Balls case. That was the one that kind of really, I guess, highlighted the absurdity of such a lot of this to me. But this question comes from Canada. A common criticism of the gender critical movement is that it aligns with the right of centre. How can we distinguish ourselves from people who are genuinely homophobic and transphobic?
Victoria Smith wrote a piece in The Critic today reviewing our book and reviewing Susanna Rustin's book Sex, which is about history of feminism, which is out next month. And Victoria made a really important point. Our feminism is not gender critical feminism. It is not sex realist feminism. It is feminism. So we just hold on to that. People may want to piggyback onto our movement. They may want to use feminism to push their particular line. They're not feminists. We just keep ploughing on. This is a fight. It's been going for thousands of years, and it will continue probably for another few hundred. But this is about women's rights and the rights of girls to grow up strong, equal, courageous women.
And it's about knowing who you are and not letting other people. I think particularly for women, I think women probably worry about this more than men would, to be honest. You have to be very centered. I know who I am. I don't, and I will go on being who I am. And there are things, there are organizations I don't, I wouldn't go and talk to, and there are organizations I mainly would work with. And you have to be very, very careful at the way these accusations are made to narrow you into boxes and subdivide. And you heard, the cross party here embraces people in the Conservative Party, some of whom wouldn't call themselves feminists necessarily, but there is a core about women's equality, women's freedom, women's ability to live and be valued and have our own lives freely, which is actually, there's a worry that the more we get pushed into boxes, the easier it is to divide and rule. So don't let other people define you. Resist that feeling in your head that you need to justify yourself. We don't need to justify ourselves.
Not at all.
Okay, we'll try and get through maybe another 3 or 4 questions, unless I get dragged off with a hook or something, a virtual hook. Who has turned out to be the most disappointing in their lack of support and/or their silence on these matters, and whose public support has actually surprised you?
Oh, that's quite tricky in an election. I'm slightly aware of an election campaign on, and I don't want to get party political, and yet some of the answers there would probably go into that territory.
The next question was about Keir Starmer.
No, whatever. No. I was going to say, without naming names, I think the lack of courage of some of our politicians has staggered me, actually. Because if you can't stand up and say unequivocally that women are adult human females and that their rights matter, then, well, that begs the question. Anyway, I don't. I just say I don't.
Susan, is it the disappointments in the lack of critical thought?
Oh yeah. The lack of curiosity, right? Because I think what happened was that people just went, I don't want to. No, I don't want to listen. I don't. No. Yeah, just let's be nice to everybody, right? And so we were considered in the early days, I think, and God love people like Julie Bindle, because she's been fighting this fight for a long time. but we were considered to be almost nasty, not just
Oh, not
grumpy,
almost, definitely nasty.
nasty,
Definitely
horrible
nasty.
old women who
Yeah.
didn't want to see people, you know, be their true self, and that's not at all who we are. So it's that lack, and people who should have known better didn't listen, they didn't read, they didn't think, they just adopted a party line or, you know, a message, or they didn't want to have a difficult conversation with people in civil society. It was really disappointing.
Will this be the start of a series of books?
Oh. I think my Twitter account currently has about 18 different suggestions for what book 2 might look like. We are very blown away by the speed. I mean, this is a book that's sold out on Amazon on the first day of publication. You've become difficult, you know, the difficulty, what later on we're going to pitch the book. We had to spend some time over the last 24 hours trying to work out where to send people, where they could find it. There's an appetite. There's a lot more storytelling to be done. So what we might do next, I don't know, but something, because what we see out there is there is a gap. There is a gap, and there are stories to be told, and there are many other people than us who need to be able to tell these stories, and we hope the success of this book will help open up that field a bit and make publishers. One of the things, the story I'd love to tell Mandy quickly, is we sat down on the 17th of May last year with a person trying to be helpful to us out of the kind of general world of sort of literature in Scotland. And he told us very firmly that it was an excellent project. He wasn't discouraging the quality, but we stood no chance of a publisher, was pretty much his message. And we gave us lots of advice on how we might self-publish, which wasn't where we saw ourselves going with this. That was 17th of May last year. We were sitting having this conversation. On the 17th of May this year, I was holding this in my hand. Physical object literally landed in the post that day, and so it's been a ridiculously quick turnaround. So huge thanks, I should say, at this point, to Little Brown for publishing us and making this beautiful book. We couldn't, and the speed at which I had to do it was just, in publishing terms, well, maybe obviously I wouldn't have known, but I now know was just mad. So there is an appetite. There are publishers who are willing to step in. So yes, the first of many books, but not just by us.
Absolutely. Looking forward to Jenny's.
Yes.
Right, so this, I'll end on, this is a question, but it says, apologies, this is not a question. It's just a thank you to the wonderful warrior women of Scotland, the fiercest and bravest of all the turf. That's a lovely way to end. Now I'm going to ask you two to do a quick pitch, and then I'll come back and just say a word of thanks and goodbye to everyone.
Okay, do that bit. Yeah, right, I'll do my bit, and then
I'll do my bits.
And then Lucy will do hers. I just want to say thank you to everybody who's joined us this evening. Thank you to everybody who has bought the book. And if you haven't bought it or want more copies, then thankfully you can now, it's back on Amazon, it's been stocked up. We sold out a lot of copies on publication day, which was quite remarkable, and it's still available in Waterstones as well. And we went into a reprint the day after it came out. So thank you everybody for your support.
Yeah, thank you very much. And the other thing, our other pitch is libraries. It's really important. Not everyone can buy a book. Books in libraries are really valuable. They get to people who wouldn't think of buying that book. And libraries just matter. So this is also a suggestion that people go into their local library, get copies ordered by their library service. I've had a message today from someone who'd taken a copy into Edinburgh Central Library, who may be on this call, in which case you know who you are. So, you know, but libraries will buy books, and it is really, really important that books aren't just seen as only available to people who can buy them.
And one last thank FiLiA for hosting and putting this amazing evening together. Grassroots feminism at its absolute best. So sisterhood and solidarity. Thank you, FiLiA.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think this is one of the largest online book launches there has ever been. So very glad that everybody was patient. Perhaps we should ask the Scottish Parliament to stock the book in the bookshop. I just want to finish tonight by reading the words that Susan and Lucy use at the very start of the book as their dedication to you all. To every woman, past and present, who stood up and spoke out, even when, her voice was shaking and her heart breaking. To every girl across the world, may you grow up to be strong, independent women whose voice is always heard. And on that note, we end this evening's webinar with a reminder from me to never comply when someone tells you to hod your wheesht. You have too much wisdom, ladies, to keep quiet. Good night and thank you.